This session is called HTML5 in Chrome. So if you're here to see XML in Firefox, that's next door. And if you're here to see KML in Internet Explorer, what are you doing here? Sorry. My name's Arne Roman Kurek. I like three things. First is meatball eyes. Second is walking around the world and talking to developers on behalf of Google about great technologies like HTML5, and about my third like, which is Google Chrome. I think it's a fantastic browser, and I have some concrete reasons to back that up, and I'm going to tell them to you, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will also mark Chrome as one of your likes. We all know Chrome is fast, and Chrome is stable, of course. It's great to use. But did you know that adoption of Chrome is actually growing very fast? In fact, as a developer, you should be aware that there are over 70 million users of Google Chrome in the world, which means that it's actually a very popular browser. In fact, 10% of web users, according to gs.statcounter.com, are using Google Chrome. It supports a ton of HTML features as well. So if you go to any site that's tracking HTML5 adoption or how many features a browser has implemented, you can see Chrome usually scores the best. In fact, on these two sites that I have listed here, it supports 26 out of the 28 features on HTML5readiness.com. And if you go to caniuse.com, it supports 92% of the features listed there. So it's very powerful, it's very modern, and it has a lot of cool features. Of course, what are those features? Maybe you don't know. Maybe you don't know that there's some stuff going on in HTML, which is really exciting. HTML, of course, is what, as a developer, you would use to write an application that runs on Chrome, like a website. And HTML has some advantages, too. First of all, I consider openness to be one of HTML's strengths. That means that basically you can write an HTML5 application, and you're not limited to Chrome. You're not limited to a single vendor. You're not limited to a single web server or anything like that. You can write it and be confident that a lot of different software will render it and run it. Features are another great asset of HTML. So this spec has been around for a long time, but only in the past year or two have a lot of really interesting, exciting new features come out. And I'm going to demo some of them for you, so I won't go too far into that here, but just know there's some really cool stuff you can do. And then finally, support. Every single browser, even including Internet Explorer, is committed to adding support for HTML5. So all of these new features that I'm showing you will eventually be available to every web user. And you'll be able to take advantage of them in every single application you write. As a developer, I'll just put out some shout outs to content that we're doing. So we do, our team creates a site called HTML5rocks.com. It's great, and if you have any more questions about anything I show you today, you can find it all up on there. There's tutorials, sample code, and even some interesting playgrounds and experiments like that. And then if you want to just see even more cool stuff, there's chromeexperiments.com. So I said you can build a lot of cool stuff with HTML, and this presentation that I'm going to show you is actually one of them. I love it because it lets me lay out everything in a consistent way that I like. It lets me do cool effects like the slide transitions, and I get to use demos directly in my slides, so it works out great for me. You can see it's not too complicated of a code base. There's about 1,000 elements, 1,000 lines of JavaScript code, and 200 CSS elements. But what's really amazing is that I'm doing things in this presentation that I could not do in HTML a year ago. And I have Chrome to thank for that. So let's talk about where have we been in terms of the web. All right? You need to know where you've been before you know where you're going. Of course, 1990 was the first web page. That was 20 years ago. It's 2 decades. It's a fairly long time. It took a few years to get popular, but in 1994 we have HTML2. That meant that the next iteration of HTML came out, and people were starting to improve on it and add new features and clean up the spec a little bit. By 1995, we had JavaScript, and this kind of started a whole new iteration and a whole new series of advancements in HTML that were very exciting and came very fast. For example, we could now script pages using a programming language that has now become the most popular programming language in the world. 96, we had CSS. We allowed websites to use styling controls to make things look very pretty. 1997, we had HTML4, so already had gone through a few revisions of the HTML spec. 98, CSS2, again, making things better, just letting them improve over time. And then in 1999, I'm sorry, I skipped over one. Well, 1999 and 2002 came two very interesting inventions. In 99, there was XML HTTP, which was thankfully created by Microsoft, and it allowed JavaScript code to do something very interesting. It let us do AJAX requests or asynchronous JavaScript requests for data on a web server. So this was fantastic, and we standardized it in 2002. And if we hadn't done that, if this feature hadn't come out there, I don't think I'd be here today, because Google builds everything using this technology. You know, Google Gmail, Google Maps, everything is built on AJAX and HTML. So it shows you how additions to web technology can let new companies and new ideas and new applications really come out and take full advantage of that and be really immersive. So in 2004, like I said, Google's kind of launched a few products. By then we had launched Gmail, we had launched Google Maps. It was a very exciting time. Of course, nothing happened for a long time. So you can see that there was a long gap in years, and that's because nobody was really adding anything to the spec. So we kept building apps, we kept building web apps, but they were very hard to program. There wasn't a lot of new features. We were building stuff, modern technology, using old technology that was getting out of date. So in last year, 2009, the W3C and the What Working Group started working on new features for HTML. And we had a spec written. And by 2010, we actually have a fair amount of these features supported, at least in Chrome. A lot of them are in Firefox and Opera, and even IE, the version 9 that came out, is supporting a lot of these features. So just to show you, again, at the beginning, had a little bit of a slow period, and then a lot of advancements in a short amount of time, and then a slow period again, but I think we're at the beginning of another very fast period of growth for the web. It's a very exciting time to be a developer. So where are we going? Well, I've laid out a few of the major topics here. We have graphics in the web now. You can actually draw and animate stuff on an element directly in the web page. We have video and audio playback that lets you play video and audio directly in the page without a plugin. This is very exciting, and I'll show you why later. We have multi-threaded applications. Applications that run in JavaScript used to be single-threaded, meaning they could slow down the browser itself. Now we can multi-thread our JavaScript applications, which allows them to be very responsive to the user while still doing very interesting things in the background. We have notifications, some desktop integrations, ways to kind of pull the user's focus into your web app. And we have real-time communication through a protocol called WebSockets, which is very cool. And I'll show you a demo of that too. And then finally, we have local storage, the ability to put a lot of data onto the client and process it there. So in addition, with threads and local storage, you can actually make a very rich and compelling client-side application using HTML. I'll make one more note before I get into the meat of everything, is I say HTML5 a lot, and I'm really using it wrong, because there's not just one HTML5 spec. It's actually built on a lot of different technologies. So you can see here I have Canvas 2D, web workers, microdata, WebSockets, geolocation, CSS3, WebGL, and oh, don't fall. Okay. So that's pretty cool, huh? And that's all JavaScript and HTML. So I'll do it again, because I like clicking that button. But you can see there's a lot of these specifications, and they all have different design documents. They're all iterating at different speeds. So when I say HTML5, just know I mean a lot of new technology that's coming into the web. It's just an easier way for me to say it. So I'll talk about my first and my most favorite HTML element or feature that's been added into the specification, and that's the Canvas element. Canvas element is really great for me because it gives you a way to draw on the web. As a kind of, when I was growing up, I did a lot of simple sample programs, I wrote a lot of games, and I really liked drawing pixels and drawing shapes and making colors work and everything like that. There was a lot of interesting math. And so now I'm very excited that I get to do that with Canvas on the web today, and it's much easier than when I was writing C code. Now, I know there's a lot of text on here. You don't have to worry about memorizing it, but I'm just going to show you that the API for programming it is actually very easy. There's, you call some setup code, you can draw some lines, some circles, some pixels, that kind of thing. And then you can style your lines and fills and everything that you're doing. But this is kind of boring, and I don't really like showing a lot of code on a slide, so I'll get to the demos. This is a bit easier to understand. So here I have a line that I'm drawing on a canvas element on this page, and I'm just drawing random lines. You can see. And I'll draw some circles, and they look a little bit different. If you can see, there's a little bit of transparency here. I'm not drawing the circle fully. Very easy, one line of code to draw each of these. But then the really cool and very powerful part of Canvas is that I can reach into each pixel in this image, and I can go and change it any way I want. So I get to drag all my old algorithms, my graphics routines out of the archives, and I can do cool things like put in an effect on this. And this isn't a filter, this isn't some sort of dynamic thing that I've applied. I've actually gone in and modified each pixel individually. So you can see here, I can keep drawing, and I can apply this a few more times. And it's just very cool how much control you have over drawing things on the web now. If you do animation work, you know that the key process for animating something is you draw it once, you erase it, and then you draw it a whole bunch of more times. And if you keep doing that, it looks like movement. So for example, you actually can draw images on a canvas and animate them this way. So now think about all the stuff you can do. You can draw pixels and you can animate them. So you could do a 2D game, for example. And if you don't like 2D games, you prefer to play 3D games or use 3D apps, there's actually 3D support for Canvas as well. So I'll just show you a little demo that Google kind of whipped up here. I guess Coolrus whipped up here. And this kind of shows you what's possible with the browser now. This is running using that 3D context that I was talking to you about. And it's 3D on the web. It actually responds like a desktop application. It looks very cool. It certainly doesn't look like a web page. But you can see that this experience is very, very awesome, but it's built using HTML and JavaScript. It's awesome. I'll put in lolcats. Yes, very nice. So you can see this is effectively an image search web page, but it gives you a very nice presentation for that. Another cool API that I love is inline, or is SVG, let's say. And the reason for that is if you do 2D work, you actually can't scale your images very easily, right? If you scale it too big, then it gets blurry or it gets pixely. So what people came up with was an API to make images that you could draw using paths and vectors and fills and using math itself. And so you can actually write these files by hand. But the thing was they needed to be hosted, they had to be valid XML, it was very difficult to use. And so what Chrome supports now is the ability to put SVG markup directly in your web page. So this code up here is actually running on this page itself. And you can see that this is not an image. This is actually a live piece of text. And to demonstrate that, I will select it. You can see. It's still text. It's not anything, a bitmap, and it's actually very curvy, very beautiful. And if I wanted to do something, for example, use Google's Translate API, which I have not verified the output of this, so if it's wrong, please don't criticize me, but I can actually translate that live. And it still retains the styling and the curvature that I laid out using, not too many lines of SVG code right up here. So it gives you some idea of how flexible you can be with layouts and with graphics on the web. And I think there's a lot of potential here to make some very cool stuff. Of course, I said there were more things than just Canvas, and the next set of things that I like to talk about is multimedia, audio and video. So we have audio and video tags, and they exist in the browser now. So you don't need a plugin to play a piece of audio. You don't need a plugin to play a piece of video. In fact, you can just drop it right in your page right there, point your browser to it, just like you would with an image tag. And of course, if you've done any JavaScript or HTML programming, you know that an image tag is very scriptable. You can do different things. You can change its size. You can take that data and draw it into a canvas, for example. You can style it using CSS. And you can do all of that with both of these tags. So for example, when you get a video embedded in Chrome itself, you'll see that the video is there. It has its own controls here because I asked for them. You can render your own controls. And you can also script the video element using JavaScript, which is fantastic. Because I can make my own buttons. You know, I can play it, and the video will play right here. And it's directly in the page. It's not running in a plugin. The browser is doing all this rendering, which means I can put CSS on it. I can put a border on there. I can put a drop shadow. I can use any of the new CSS properties, which are really exciting. And I'll talk a little bit more about them. But I think really the coolest thing about it is you can take a video, and you can actually, let me just play that again. Yeah. And you can actually draw it into a canvas, frame by frame. So if I wanted to do something crazy, like slice up the video and animate it back and forth, you could see that I can do this directly in the canvas using native JavaScript, not C code, not any plugins, nothing like that. And it's actually fast enough to play the video at full speed. So this is really amazing. Think about all the stuff that you can do now that you can play video live directly in the page itself and have access to all that data. And you can apply filters in JavaScript, you can do pixel manipulations, anything you want. So let's step back a little bit, and let's talk about something a little bit less sexy visually, but I think still very important, very interesting to use. So I said that you can store a lot of data on the client, and that basically means that you can make some very rich client-side applications. So for example, you can see here that I'm storing data about this presentation on the presentation itself using an API that we call the local storage API. You can see I've been rehearsing a little bit today. And every time I reload this presentation, you'll actually see that number increment. So it just takes a second to load. So now what you can see is that I'm storing data, and it's persisting even though I'm going away somewhere else. Even if I close the browser and reopen it, that data is still stored there, and it's scoped to each web page. And not like a cookie where that data gets sent to the server every time you make a web request. That's actually just stored there in the browser itself. So you can use a lot of it. You can write up to 5 megabytes of data that way, and you can also just keep it secure. You know it's not being transferred over the wire. So you can use it to store things like credentials or preferences for the current user. We also have, if you don't want to just write data directly into an array, like we have with local storage, you can write SQL. You can put SQL code directly into a page itself and have a database and run queries on it, and even insert tons of data. So if you want to write an application that has a database on the server, and you want to download some of that for the client can actually cache a lot of that data and make SQL queries that are very fast, because honestly, most web clients are not really used fully. I'm using this on a MacBook, and there's a lot of CPU processing power that's not being used right now. So if I wanted to make this app use SQL and make fetches over thousands of rows, it would still be much faster than going out to the web server, making the server do the request, and come back to me. So there's some interesting stuff you can do there. And there's a few more APIs about client-side data that might be interesting, but sadly I don't have a demo for, because they're a little bit too new and not quite implemented yet. So for example, index database. So if you don't like SQL, and I don't blame you if you don't, you can put objects directly into this data store and query them using an index. You can use file APIs. So there's going to be the option of writing and reading files in a virtual file system that's scoped to your web page itself. So your web page can actually act a lot more like a desktop application with a file API. And then finally, there's a app cache API. And this app cache API will let you mark certain files which exist on your web page to be downloaded by the browser. And now every time the browser wants to request those files, it'll check that cache first, which means that if you are disconnected from the internet and you go to whatever page you have the app cache on, you can actually have, the browser will actually serve that page offline, which means you can have offline apps, disconnected apps that do all their processing on the client, storing that data, and then syncing with the web when they get access again. But I want to show a demo, so I'll move on to worker threads. So you have all this data locally, And what are you going to do with it? Well, obviously, you need to start writing JavaScript code that starts processing a lot of data. And the trouble with this is that JavaScript is single-threaded. So if you know anything about thread-based programming, or GUI programming, you know that you don't want to do every single operation in the same thread. And the reason for that is that your UI will slow down and be less responsive for the user. We call that jankiness in Chrome, and a lot of Chrome is written to remove all that jankiness so that it feels very smooth and responsive. Of course, we want the web experience to be the same way, so we don't want slow JavaScript operations slowing down the user interface. So what I was writing this summer was a web-based paint application. And what I wanted it to do was let me kind of draw a line, straight line, and kind of just have it be smooth. Now you can see when I drew that, it wasn't very smooth, and the reason for that is because I also wanted to support undo. Basically, every time someone wanted to draw something, I wanted to keep the last state in memory so that I could go back to it if they decided to undo the last operation. So I needed to calculate the difference in the canvas between the old version and the new one. Of course, this is a fairly expensive operation. You can see here that the difference calculation, which shows up on the right, is actually firing so slowly that it's actually slowing down the mouse events that's drawing the line. I can't draw a straight line anymore. So I'll use a web worker with the same exact code, but just load it differently. And what that will do is actually run the difference calculation in a separate thread. You can see here that the diff firing is much faster. So it's not completely unbroken, but you can definitely get a smoother sense that the UI is flexible and is actually responding to what you're doing. And the way that this works is just because that diff calculation goes in the background and gets called whenever the CPU has some spare cycles, which means that it prioritizes the UI thread and that my UI is still very fast, and I get that mouse event a lot faster. It's pretty good. So I see some people are playing with this already, so that's pretty cool. If you have a laptop open right now, you can point it at this link. Yes, we will get some people contributing to this. This is using a protocol called WebSockets, so I'll just draw a little bit here too. Yeah. See if we can fill up this whole square. Shouldn't take very long. Nice. So while you're playing with that, I'll tell you what's going on in the background. If you have to make web requests from a page using Ajax, it actually usually requires you to make a new HTTP request every time you want to send some data or get it back from the server. Now, this is a problem because HTTP is actually very inefficient. It's very, for sending small bits of data or streaming data, it's not the best protocol. So what the spec started to introduce is this idea of WebSockets, where every time you load a web page in a browser that supports WebSockets, you can open up a connection to the server and you can pipe data back and forth 2 ways. So this lets you create apps that take a lot of user input from multiple sources and stream all that data back down to each client who's connected to the page itself. So you have a client-server-based model. You can see here, we're kind of outsourcing this painting very fast. I love it. It's going really cool. And the reason that it's so responsive, every time that you click, everyone else who's viewing that web page will see your pixel, is because of WebSockets. It's a very lightweight, fast protocol for transferring data back and forth on the web. That's awesome. So, what can you do when you have these kind of more complex applications, for example, that are storing a lot of data and sending it back to a server using this fast server, client-server protocol? It seems like these APIs are leading web applications to become more like desktop applications. And I love that. And so do the spec writers. So they're adding a lot of new features into Chrome, into the HTML5 specifications that allow web apps to have deeper integration into the client computer itself. So for example, drag and drop. Okay, so I started off with a really lame example because we could all do this with jQuery, even a few years ago, probably. If you were clever enough with JavaScript, you could do something like this. But the thing is that these events are now implemented using native browser events. So unlike jQuery, that means that the browser can actually tell the web page something about the drag and drop event that's happening. What might the browser tell the native page about, drag and drop events that are happening? Well, for example, if I go into my desktop And say I have an image file, like the Chrome logo, and I want to manipulate it on the web page itself, and I don't want to upload it to a server, I can actually just drag it right into there. And you can see I'm actually manipulating, I always do that, I'm actually manipulating files, file data, on a web page without sending it to a server. So think about that. You can actually have a useful web application that runs locally or offline that's doing stuff with your operating system, like manipulating files, and it doesn't have to contact a server, it doesn't have to do anything. That's how powerful HTML has gotten. It's no longer relying on a server to do a lot of this work. We have a little bit more integration, so if you use Macs, maybe you have a program installed called Growl that will pop up every time something interesting happens on your operating system. Well, we like that model in Chrome, and what we did, especially because Google has a lot of properties that want to alert the user very gently that something might be happening on the web, we actually have this idea of web notification. What that will do is actually kind of call the user's attention to something even if they're not in the same tab or even if the browser's not maximized. So I'll just request permission to use this feature. I'll say allow. And now I'll show a notification. Just kind of back out here. You can see, this looks like a pop-up window, but it's not. It's kind of sitting there. It's independent. If I had the browser minimized, the web notification would show. And this is actually a great tool for sites like Gmail or Google Calendar that will actually give you notifications instead of an alert box, which will steal the user away from whatever they're doing. So it's nice, subtle, and you can even script these. You can put dynamic content in there if you'd like. Of course, we add features all the time, and one of my favorite features actually came out of the mobile web. So keep in mind that all of these features, these HTML5 features, get put in there because people need them. People are building devices, they're building browsers that need to do some interesting things. So they go to the spec, and they actually add in spec features for their use cases. One such use case is the mobile browser. So imagine a mobile browser where you wanted a web page to know how the device is tilted. Well, sure enough, the Chrome or the Android browser team decided we want to expose that, and there was a spec was written, spec was standardized, and they committed a patch to WebKit which gave these notifications. Now, because the Android browser uses WebKit and Chrome uses WebKit, Chrome got the benefit of that, and now Chrome has device orientation APIs inside of it, which is only about a week or two old right now. So it's very new, and it's very cool, because not only does my mobile phone have an orientation sensor, but my laptop does. And the reason it has that is so that if I drop it, the hard drive will stop itself from spinning and won't crash. But what's really cool is when I actually integrate that into a page. So you can see here, I have to pick this up, that when I tilt my laptop, I can actually tilt content on the page because it's actually hooked into that sensor. It's really cool. Of course, oh, yeah. Thank you. So you can see here, if you never knew what was behind the Chrome logo, I can actually show you now. Isn't that cool? That's really cool. I bet you didn't know it had some depth to it. So it gives you some interesting ideas about some demos or cool samples you can do with the device orientation API. And I love putting stuff together, keep adding on features and APIs. So for example, this is what I would do with physics and video. Is that cool? Now think, you like that, huh? Okay, how many people saw Inception? So think about what I'm doing. Think about what I'm doing here right now. I have a physics engine. Oh, it's getting all jumpy. Just shake it up. Okay, that's better. Think about what I'm doing. I have a physics engine, and I have a video, and I have this orientation event, which fires very often, and I'm combining it all together using JavaScript, which really shows you how fast Chrome has gotten. You know, you couldn't do this in JavaScript a couple years ago. I mean, even if you had all these APIs, the browsers weren't fast enough. So now Chrome is just so fast that I can take raw video, manipulate it in a way, run it through a complex physics engine, and then render it out to the user on a web page. And it's smooth, and it runs at 60 frames per second. It's really cool. It's a great demo. It's great technology, and it just shows you how powerful a web app you can write today. So we showed you some nice APIs, some new features that you could use, and some deep integrations into the client operating system. Let's talk about how CSS has improved to make things look beautiful. So for example, if you've ever used CSS, this might be your opinion about how CSS is. It kind of sucks. And it sucks. And you know, how many times have you tried to do something like lay out something that has the full height of the page, or maybe content that's centered vertically inside of the page, or your wrapping is weird, and it also makes everything look very boxy. It makes everything look like you're making boxes everywhere. So it's very hard to make an organic or interesting looking website. Well, we have a bunch of new style options, and you know, while they're not perfect yet, I still think it's a lot of movement in the right direction. So for example, I can make colors using hue, saturation, luminance, which might not be that interesting to you if you're a kind of web developer, but if you're a graphic designer, you love that. That's really a huge feature for you, because you're probably using this color model for most of your work anyway. So, but in addition to just different color models, which you know, has different varying levels of usefulness for you, you can do things like put a text shadow directly on the text itself. So you can see that this text actually is getting a dynamic shadow rendered on it. It's still text. It's just like that SVG example where I can select it, I can copy and paste it. If I'm writing a website, a screen reader, someone who's blind can actually still take full advantage of the website content without me having to use any hacks like image replacement. I can do things like put a shadow on the box itself so you can see the shadow on the page. I can even give a stroke around the text, which kind of makes a border around the text itself, makes it more stand out a little bit more. I'll just make that text pop just a little bit. And now the holy grail of CSS, in my opinion, is the rounded corners. I can do rounded corners in one line of code. You know how many lines of code I had to use to do this back in the day? I would have to slice up an image into 9 different images, and I'd have to put them out there, or I'd have to use a table layout, or I'd have to have really ugly, like hundreds of lines of CSS to do this. It's one line of code now. I mean, the second you feel comfortable just, you know, not supporting legacy browsers, your code gets so much simpler. It's so much fun. And you can do things like use reflection, for example, which for some reason is in there and is very useful, I guess, but it's still pretty cool. You can do other things. So if you have an element on the page, you can do a transform. So you can make it a different size using CSS, finally. I mean, you could always do width and height, but it kind of made it look weird sometimes. So you can actually transform it with height. You can rotate it, which I showed you. A lot of those demos that I was doing had rotating elements. And that's all the CSS transforms. You can skew it. You can deform the image itself. And then one of my favorite parts of this, new CSS syntax that we have is that we can actually declare a transition, which says take this one property of CSS, and every time it changes a value, don't just make it look different right away. Just let the browser animate it over time. So for example, you can put a transition on the transform for rotation, and then you can see that this, not only does this div rotate, but it rotates slowly. In fact, it rotates in 2 seconds, and it uses a kind of in and out timing function. And what that lets you do is give you complex, interesting animations that aren't dependent on JavaScript. So even if a user has JavaScript turned off, they can still see this and interact with a page this way. Also, the animation is controlled completely by Chrome. So Chrome always makes sure that it renders fairly smoothly, even if the computer's slow or is taxed. Or it'll drop frames as needed just to make the animation work correctly. You can do a little bit more. So for example, if you've ever been a fan of making all your users annoyed by using the blink tag, well, you can get a lot more annoying. You can have the pulse tag now, which is amazing. I think we're breaking new ground in terms of annoying CSS effects that we're doing here. But seriously, it actually gives you a great amount of control over the animation itself. You can have different keyframes, so different portions of the animation are in different states. And so you can say that halfway through the animation you should be here, and a full way through the animation you should be here. And you can loop that infinitely, and you can say, oh, play it backwards when you're done. You can also do beautiful fonts. So for example, here is a random ransom note, and it's using fonts that I just downloaded. Well, actually, the browser just downloaded from Google's font API. And I only included them using a few lines of code, and I'm able to make fonts dynamic and interesting and use any true type or open type font out there. So I mentioned the Google Font API. We have a large directory of fonts available, openly licensed, so you can use them in anything from a student project to a commercial application. And you can see here that now you actually finally have full control over the text that you're displaying on your web page. It doesn't have to be boring Arial or boring Georgia or whatever the 5 fonts that you could rely on back in the day were. So now you can do logos and interesting things and apply all the CSS to the font itself to make some really interesting effects. And then finally, my kind of favorite is the flexible box model. So if you've ever done any work with layouts, like I mentioned, getting full height, full width, you knew how much of a pain it is. And now CSS supports a layout model that's more like writing a desktop application where you say, I want a column, and I want it to be this wide, and I want it to anchor all the way to the right. I have another column, it's all the way on the left. And then I want the column in the middle to just expand out to be the correct width. And you can do that. It's very easy, a few lines of code. So you can make layouts like that. And then you can also say that things should be centered vertically, finally. So you can actually keep, for example, that little box in the middle there, just centered vertically. And if you notice, if you're very observant, you can actually see that the content on the slide is also centered vertically using the same technique. So you can see how it adjusts to fit the space that's left when I adjust the size of the element inside. And that's all done using CSS. I don't have to use any JavaScript for this. I basically just tell Chrome how I want the page to look. Chrome does all the work. I don't have to do any math calculations or anything like that. So CSS is awesome. It's not boring anymore. You can do some very, very cool stuff and keep it selectable, keep it translatable, keep it accessible to people who have disabilities, and you get some really cool output. I love it. I love working with it. So in conclusion, there's a few major points. If I've gotten you excited about some demos today, that's great. If I've kind of showed you something that you haven't seen before, I'm very happy about that. But I want to make 4 points before I leave. I want to make sure I have enough time to do them. Basically, if you learn anything about HTML today, keep in mind features. So features are being added all the time. You can do things that are more desktop application-like, and there's new features coming out down the road. So just keep in mind that if there's something that you didn't think a website could do, chances are you're going to be able to do it in the future, because a lot of new applications are being written for the web. A lot of websites are getting more advanced functionality, and we also have these mobile devices in our pockets that run full-featured web browsers that can take advantage of all of these functionality. And we want to expose things like gyroscope and compass and voice input and camera all into the web. So keep in mind, features, right? Momentum. Chrome releases a new version every 6 weeks. So like I said, that orientation API came out about 2 weeks ago. Well, in 4 weeks, that will be available to all 70+ million users of Chrome. Think about how powerful that is, that we have a browser that's adopting features this quickly and rolling them out to users in production that quickly. It means that you can start doing this stuff today. You can start experimenting. If you are writing for a platform that's limited to Chrome, for example, Chrome extensions use HTML, you can actually use these features today. If you're writing a Chrome web app, like we're launching pretty soon by the end of the year, this is basically a store for web apps that run, that can be installed into Chrome. If you're writing one of those, you can use these features for that as well. But don't be limited by just using these things. It's the web, right? It should be open. And so start experimenting with them on your website. They all have fallbacks, so if the browser doesn't support it, you can show something else. But the great thing about them is you can make your website a lot more dynamic. So momentum, stuff's moving very fast. Adoption, like I said, so today you can play with Chrome. You can use a lot of these features, especially Canvas has really good adoption now in Mozilla and Internet Explorer, the version 9 that just came out. And so every single browser maker has said, we're going to start adopting these. So you don't have to be afraid that only Chrome is going to use them in the future. And then finally, community. So if I've done anything, if you've gotten excited at all and you want to go home and write something, write a physics demo or an orientation demo or something, please share it with the rest of the web. Because we need to get the word out. We need to get people excited that, hey, look at all the stuff you can do on the web now. You can write this stuff using JavaScript. You're not limited to using compiled code, writing it cross-platform, et cetera. You can write HTML JavaScript code that will run pretty reliably on all the operating systems and get people excited about that, make it very, very engaging. And we need to do that because we need to make, because the spec itself is only as strong as the people who are using it. So if I beg anything of you today, please get out there, write something, and then tweet it at me. I'll tweet it out to everybody else if it's cool. And let's keep the spec going, keep the engagement high. So with that, I am pretty much done. There's a few links on the slide, but thank you very much for your attention, and I had a great time talking to you about HTML5 and Chrome.
So thank you, Arne. ขอสรุปเป็นภาษาไทยสักคร่าวๆนะครับเราก็คงได้เห็นฟีเจอร์ของ HTML5 นะครับก็ไม่ทราบว่าเราเป็นชาติเดียวในโลกหรือเปล่านะครับที่ไม่ได้เรียกว่า HTML5 นะครับนะฮะก็คงมีแต่ชาติเราที่พูดภาษาไทยนะครับก็คงได้เห็นหลายๆอย่างนอกจากสิ่งที่เราคงทราบดีกันแล้วรู้จักกันแล้วนะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นวิดีโอ audio เป็น first class เหมือนกับที่ image เคยเป็นนะครับแล้วก็ API ต่างๆมากมายนะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นเรื่องของการเชื่อมโยงกับ storage ต่างๆทั้ง local variable นะฮะ file API DB web SQL นะครับส่วนของการส่งผ่านข้อมูลโดย web protocol ที่เรียก web socket นะครับแล้วก็การ integrate กับการทำงานของ operating system นะฮะรวมถึงการฟีเจอร์เพิ่มเติมใน CSS นะครับซึ่งผมคงไม่ไปลงรายละเอียดนะครับในส่วนต่างๆเพราะคิดว่าทางคุณอาเน่นะครับก็ได้พูดได้แสดงค่อนข้างเคลียร์นะครับทีนี้ในส่วนของคำถามเนี่ยนะครับผมเข้าใจว่าหลายท่านในห้องนี้นะครับแล้วก็หลายๆท่านที่ทวีตด้วยนะครับหรืออาจจะดูทางบ้านด้วยน่าจะมีคำถามคล้ายๆกันนะผมขออนุญาตถามแทนก่อนเลยก็แล้วกันนะครับว่าคำถามที่เราน่าจะมีในใจหลายคนคิดว่าเมื่อก่อนเนี่ยเราเจอปัญหาความไม่เข้ากันของ CSS นะครับที่ว่าเขียน CSS ตัวหนึ่งในเบราว์เซอร์ตัวหนึ่งแสดงอย่างหนึ่งนะครับเขียนไปแสดงอีกตัวหนึ่งเป็นอีกอย่างหนึ่งแล้ว HTML5 มันจะเป็น the new CSS ปัญหาแบบนั้นหรือเปล่านะครับขออนุญาตถามคำถามนี้แทนก่อนเลย So Arne, first I have a question for you myself. You remember a few years ago when CSS was a new kid on the block, right? We have to write CSS differently for supporting each browser. So my question is, what's the level of the compatibility among the browser for HTML5, and what are those features you talk about supported exclusively by Chrome's and not by the others? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it does come up, and adoption is obviously an issue when the spec is moving this fast and is this new. So I can actually show you. When I was talking about CSS is a good example of this. You might actually notice that I have this prefix here on some of these, and that's called WebKit. And the reason for that is because as CSS features are implemented, they're not usually standardized. Mm-hmm. In fact, Mozilla, for example, had a different syntax for rounded corners than Chrome or Safari did. And the way that this works, and this is actually a good thing, is that each browser that wants to implement such a feature does it in the way that they feel is best. And then they prefix it with WebKit or in Mozilla's case, MOZ, or Opera's case, O. And what happens is people start using it, and of course, it works on that browser. and they go to the standards bodies and they say, we would like to add this to the standard. And the standards body says, okay, well, this is now a feature, write up a spec for it, and then that is discussed amongst everyone who's used that feature before. And so over time, these features become standardized, and in the example of border radius, actually, implementations can actually drop that prefix from the CSS itself. So you can see that over time, we're actually having very good success with this kind of thing. So a lot of properties like text shadow and border radius have become standardized enough so that we feel comfortable using them in all the browsers. You could use border radius in IE9, you could use it in Firefox, you can use it in Chrome, in Opera. So it takes some time, but the features are getting standardized, which is actually very unique because back when IE6 was creating features, the spec groups were kind of on the other point of view where they said, we don't want to add all these features in. So now we're seeing a completely different kind of point of view where people are very excited about adding these features and getting them standardized so that adoption is greater. So, if you have any questions about HTML5 specs in general, I would suggest caniuse.com, which is great because it'll actually show you, not only each feature and which browser supports it, but if it has an upcoming feature, upcoming release, you can see which version will support it in the future if it's not supported. Or you could see which version added support. So you can see here, it has all these APIs. And Chrome usually does very well, and other browsers I think do pretty well as, you can see here the prefixes that are used. So.
ก็คำคงสรุปคร่าวๆนะครับกับคำตอบนะครับก็คือว่าHTML5 เนี่ยนะครับก็คงเป็นทั้งข่าวดีและข่าวร้ายของ Web Developer ในเวลาเดียวกันนะครับเป็นข่าวดีก็คือเราคงจะสามารถทำสิ่งที่เราไม่เคยทำได้มาก่อนโดยใช้ Standard Technology บนเว็บแต่เป็นข่าวร้ายก็คือว่าเราคงต้องทำกันบ้านกันหนักขึ้นนะครับเราคงต้องทำกันบ้านกันหนักขึ้นที่ว่าตัวไหน support อะไรบ้างนะครับตัวไหน support อะไรบ้างก็เว็บเมื่อสักครู่นะครับ Can I Use ก็เป็นตัวหนึ่งที่เราเข้าไปศึกษาได้นะครับแล้วก็ฟีเจอร์ต่างๆเนี่ยอาจจะเริ่มจากการเป็นbrowser only คือ support ในบาง browser support ในบาง engine นะครับแล้วก็ค่อยๆเข้าไปอยู่ใน standard ซึ่งเมื่อเข้าไปอยู่ใน standard แล้วเนี่ยนะครับก็อาจจะมีอาการที่ว่า browser บางตัวอาจจะ implement standard ไม่เหมือนกันอีกนะครับก็เป็นเรียกว่าปัญหาโลกแตกปัญหานี้คงไม่ได้หนีเราไปไหนนะครับมีคำถามอื่นไหมครับ
What about security? It looks like the operating system interaction, the WebSockets, and just the flexibility of the appearance open up whole new realms for hacking and spoofing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think obviously hacking and spoofing will always be an issue on the web. There's not going to be any technology that solves it. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to it. So a lot of these specifications, even though they're very flexible, have been designed with security in mind. In fact, whenever a new feature is proposed, first thing anyone ever says is, what about this way it can be abused and so on. So for example, you mentioned WebSockets, which are used using a very specific protocol. So you can't just open an arbitrary socket between the web page and any server or any computer on the network. You actually need to write a WebSocket compliant server that accepts this connection. So in that case, it's not really any different from a normal HTTP server. It just streams data differently. In terms of other things like geolocation or the notifications, there's a permissions API built into all of these. So you can actually see, when I was doing my demo for notifications, I had to actually hit approve for that page to show me a notification. So we're also working with permissions and making sure that the user knows that this kind of data is being accessed, and do you want to allow it, do you want to deny it? So we're trying to learn from mistakes that I think earlier specs allowed for things like phishing and pop-ups and stuff like that. So we're trying to take those lessons and apply them to these new specs before they come out. And so everything like local storage is scoped per domain, which is a security precaution that came in with Ajax as well. So we're using that model for local storage SQL databases. So only the domain itself pages hosted on the domain can read local storage for that domain. They can't read the local storage for another website. So sandboxing, yeah. Is there anything like a security manager? Well, I can show you that Chrome actually has, preferences page, and we're always working on making this better. But you can actually see that there's entries here for things like notification, locations, in addition to where you would be able to turn on cookies in JavaScript. So we're treating each of these features just like the browser treats sensitive stuff like cookies or JavaScript or plugins.
นะครับคำถามเป็นเรื่องเกี่ยวกับ security นะครับว่าเมื่อมันมี API ใหม่มีความสามารถใหม่เนี่ยมันจะมีความน่ากลัวทางด้าน security ใหม่ๆตามมาไหมนะครับเช่นมีเรื่องเกี่ยวกับการ deep integration กับ operating system ที่ทำงานนะครับกับ local file system นะครับแบบนี้จะทำให้เกิดปัญหา security ตามมาไหมถ้าเกิดมีใครบางคนเขียนเว็บแอปไม่ดีนะครับเว็บแอปที่มี intention ไม่ดีนะครับแล้ว access อะไรกับบางอย่างของเรานะครับก็คำตอบส่วนหนึ่งนะครับก็เป็นลักษณะของการทำงานลักษณะของ sandboxing นะครับคือโมเดลมันเป็นแบบนี้นะครับแต่แน่นอนว่าทุกโมเดลมันก็ต้องมีจุดอ่อนของมันนะครับแล้วทางบางทีเป็นจุดอ่อนทาง technical นะครับซึ่งคำตอบโดยทั่วไปเนี่ยนะครับก็เป็นว่าก็มีความพยายามที่จะเพิ่ม security พวกนี้เข้าไปเรื่อยๆนะครับแต่ปัญหาพวกนี้มันแก้ไม่จบหรอกครับก็ขอคำถามสุดท้ายนะครับ
Hello. Since it looks like everything is on the HTML, on the AJAX, on the CSS, and let's example is I write down a good game on the HTML5. I think everyone can see the code and can copy it by just left click and show the source file. Do you have any idea on protection of privacy, something like that?
Yeah, so this becomes more of a question as as web pages start to have more functionality. So obviously, you don't want your code to be copied, but then at the same time, you have to think about the web itself and the way that it's kind of grown up. If you use tools like Clojure Compiler, which Google released as a JavaScript compiler, it actually puts out code that's almost indistinguishable. You can't unravel by hand, basically. Now, obviously, if someone's very malicious and wants to steal that code and copy it and modify it or whatever, they can do that. But at the same time, you have to wonder if you have a website. Remember, this is still the web that we're talking about. An example I like to do when people ask me this is if you have Gmail. Right? Gmail is a very sophisticated web application that has a lot of features, and if you run it in Chrome, actually does things like use APIs like drag and drop files. And it wouldn't do anyone really any good to copy Gmail's source code because there's a lot to Gmail on the server and the infrastructure that it's not the HTML and JavaScript that make Gmail work. It just gives that great UI. So we're not really concerned about people saving that and pirating that code. And if you ever look at Gmail source, I challenge you to figure out what's going on. It's like just really hard to read. So hopefully that'll give you some security, I think.
ก็ยังเป็นประเด็น security นะครับแต่คราวนี้เป็น code security นะครับว่าถ้าเกิดว่ามันเป็น HTML เป็น JavaScript เนี่ยนะครับแอปพลิเคชันที่เราอุตส่าห์ develop ขึ้นมาเนี่ยนะครับจะถูก copy ได้ง่ายๆไหมนะครับคำตอบนี้มี2ประเด็นนะครับประเด็นที่1ก็คือว่าไม่แน่ใจนะครับว่ามีจริงหรือเปล่านะครับแต่อาจจะมี tools ลักษณะที่ว่าเป็น code obfuscator นะครับ code obfuscator ก็ทำให้โค้ดอะไรมันอ่านไม่ออกง่ายๆนะครับ2ก็คือว่าเว็บแอปพลิเคชันตัวหนึ่งเนี่ยมันมีอะไรที่มากกว่าตัว front end นะครับดังนั้นเนี่ยถึงการเอาโค้ดตรง front ที่ HTML ที่ render ออกมาได้เนี่ยนะครับไปมันอาจจะไม่มีประโยชน์อะไรกับแอปพลิเคชันนะครับนี่คือคำตอบรวมๆนะครับก็คงเซสชันนี้คงจะจบเท่านี้นะครับ so thank you Arne
Thank you very much.